This video is brought to you by Ground News. With Nigel Farage and his Reform UK party performing even better than expected in last week's elections, all eyes appear to be on them and their trajectory. Reform seem to be the main beneficiaries of Labour's polling collapse since the election, and if things continue to work in their favour, there's now a distinct possibility that they could lead the next government. The thing is, though, little has been discussed so far about Reform's policy platform. There's an assumption that they're just a party to the right of the Conservatives whose main focus is on immigration. While there is some merit to this interpretation, it loses some of the ideological weirdness about their political platform. So, in this video, we're going to have a proper look into Reform's policy platform and find out exactly what they do if they win the next general election. After 14 long years out of power, how's Starmer doing at the helm of the UK? Well, it's a mixed bag. So check out our analysis of Labour's leader, their foreign policy and economic issues in our magazine Too Long. Read more by clicking the link in the description. We're going to split this video into two parts. First, we're going to have a look at Reform's so-called contract with you, which is essentially their manifesto from last year, before then moving on and having a look at how their policy offering has evolved in the 10 months since the election. In the run-up to the election last year, Farage was reluctant to describe Reform's 28-page document outlining what they'd do if they won the election as a manifesto, arguing that manifestos keep making the same promises and no one believes a word of what they say. Despite this, it is functionally the same as a manifesto, and provides us with some insight into what their policies would be if they were to win an election. Now, there are too many in the document to go through, but fortunately for us, they've highlighted 5 core commitments that they'd focus on. Reducing immigration, reducing small boats crossing the channel, eliminating the NHS waiting list, increasing the income tax starting threshold, and scrapping net zero plans. Digging down a bit deeper, Reform explained that on immigration, they'd freeze non-essential immigration to the UK, with very few exceptions. They explained that essential skills, mainly around healthcare, must be the only exception. In addition to this, Reform have claimed that they'd introduce a new employer immigration tax, which would see the national insurance levy for employers raised to 20% for foreign workers, again with limited exceptions. When it comes to small boats, Reform claims to have a 4-point plan to actually stop the boats once and for all. The most significant of these is the promise to leave the European Convention on Human Rights, something that some on the right of the Conservative Party, such as Robert Jenrick, have also been campaigning for. This is something that Farage himself has wanted to do for much of his political life, and in an interview with ITV News last year, is the thing he claimed he'd do first if he became Prime Minister, claiming that it would give the UK the ability to once again control its own borders. On the NHS, Reform has essentially promised to try and use economic incentives to retain staff, promising them an exemption from the basic rate of tax for 3 years, while also giving 20% tax relief on private healthcare, which they claim will relieve pressure on the NHS. This is at the same time as giving NHS patients a voucher for private treatment if they can't see a GP within 3 days, and providing the NHS itself with an extra £17 billion per year. On tax, Reform is keen to make a promise to lift 7 million of the least well-off out of income tax by raising the starting threshold to £20,000. However, in addition to this, they've also stated that they're going to cut tax across the board, with the total adding up to a loss for the Exchequer of around £70 billion. And finally, on net zero, Farage has broken with some of his past statements, suggesting that instead of calling for a referendum on it, his party would simply scrap net zero and related subsidies. Together, if these changes were enacted, there'd be some of the most radical changes to the state of any government in living memory. And just to be clear, these are just the headline key promises from the contract with you. In some other significant but not necessarily headline promises, Reform also committed to introducing proportional representation, banning so-called transgender ideology in schools, and introducing a royal commission on social care. However, it's worth recognising that Reform has gone through something of an evolution when it comes to policy since the contract was published. Earlier this year, Farage pointed out that economics might be bigger than immigration for us at the next election. For a party that seemed so committed to immigration in their manifesto that wasn't a manifesto last year, the first 2 of their 5 priorities were related to immigration, this seems like a significant change in approach. And even more strangely, it seems that Farage is actually moving left when it comes to the economy. A few weeks ago, Farage openly criticised Labour for not going further on British Steel, suggesting that they should have nationalised it, and suggesting that if he were Prime Minister, he would have nationalised it. Similarly, Farage has started acting friendlier to trade unions, with Sky News reporting that he failed to criticise the Unite union for their bin strike in Birmingham. This is in addition to Farage reportedly trying to sweet-talk unions, brandishing their leaflets in public and speaking their language. Neither of these things seem particularly natural for a man who's seen as a staunch advocate of the free market. However, it seems that Farage knows that his target in the next election will likely not be the Conservatives, but rather Labour, and he's keen to take the fight to them. One of the big advantages of being a leader of a political upstart is you're not as wedded to ideology as other more established parties, allowing you to crisscross across the political spectrum without too much scrutiny from the media. This seems to be what Farage is flirting with now. Significantly too, it seems that he's able to do this without alienating his voter base. Recent polling from YouGov demonstrated that a majority of Reform voters supported public ownership of water, rail and energy. The point we're making here is that while the economy is becoming more of a priority for Reform, it's not as though they would simply govern as right-wing Conservatives. Rather, they'd likely temper their approach and govern in such a way that they can solicit support from parties across the political spectrum. Now, that's not to say that they haven't doubled down on some policy positions. Indeed, following the local elections, Farage suggested that the newly elected Reform councils would scrap diversity roles, that Reform councils would resist asylum seekers, and that his councils would go to war on net zero projects. Perhaps then, if we want to know exactly how Reform would govern nationally, we'll need to keep an eye on how much they temper their plans in local government. This is a complex and nuanced story though, and as such there's plenty more to read about this online, with 307 sources reporting on it. The issue is, how can you be sure that what you're reading isn't hugely biased? Well, that's a problem we face when making these videos too, and luckily that's where this week's sponsor Ground News comes in. For this story in particular, they've identified that there are at least 48 left-leaning sources and 42 right-leaning sources reporting on it. In fact, in addition to this, they've also shown the main differences in headlines among left-leaning and right-leaning outlets, with left-leaning outlets focusing on the narrow margin of victory for Reform at the by-election and the seismic nature of their victory, while right-leaning outlets highlighted the fact that Labour's vote share has crumbled. We're able to do that because of our sponsor Ground News, whose incredible website and app lets you discover the news and pulls back the curtain on media bias. That's because every story comes with a quick visual breakdown of the political bias, factuality and ownership of the source's reporting, all backed by ratings from 3 independent news monitoring organisations. But one of the best parts of the app is their blind spot feed. It presents you with stories and articles that haven't been reported on by one side of the aisle or the other, helping you better break out of your media bubble and discover what those on the other side of the political spectrum are really saying. This is all in addition to the biased distribution we mentioned earlier, and together these fantastic features help you to figure out exactly who's behind the stories you're reading and what agenda they may have. Ground News is such a useful tool for our current media landscape, and I think an app like this will only become more essential as the media landscape continues to evolve. If you're interested in everything that Ground News has to offer, you can get 40% off the Unlimited Access Vantage plan using the link in the description or by scanning the QR code. This offer is only available here, so make sure you go to ground.news/TLDR or click the link in the description to get started and support an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.